Thank you, Senator Harms. Senator McCoy, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. President and members. I rise this afternoon in opposition to this motion to override the veto of LB599. I've opposed LB599 throughout its journey through our legislative process for a number of different reasons, some of which have already been mentioned by others here on the floor this afternoon, many of which I brought up in earlier rounds of discussion on this legislation in the last few weeks. I believe the information that potentially there are organizations that could receive dollars under this legislation that don't share the same belief system that I do in regard to the importance of being pro-life, which I am, is a concern that has a lot of merit. And there are those that said, well, how come this concern about this money going to organizations that may provide abortion services, how come this wasn't raised earlier? It wasn't contemplated earlier. You might remember I stood up and supported an amendment that was adopted to an earlier piece of legislation, LB540, earlier in the session, that many of you voted for, that would have prevented, and we didn't end up dealing with that piece of legislation on select file and final reading, but that amendment was adopted on a general file that would have prevented those who provide abortion services from receiving dollars under that legislation. Wasn't contemplated until last week that might be possible under this bill. I have sitting here an annual report from Planned Parenthood of the Heartland that talks about 2 clinics in Des Moines that provide prenatal care. Senator Campbell may be very well correct that currently Planned Parenthood doesn't provide prenatal service in Nebraska. But guess what? Nothing in LB599 prevents them from deciding to do that from here forward. That's greatly troubling to me. The last thing I'd mention to you in my emails and calls from my constituents and the contacts that I've received are overwhelmingly against this legislation. But one contact I had from a constituent family jumped out at me throughout the multitude that there has been in the last couple of weeks. And it was an email from a young family, my legislative district. It's within walking distance of our home. Young family, much like ours, maybe that's why it resonated with me. Young business owner, or I should say young family that has a business, much like ours. And they talked about, in the current economic climate that we're in, what a difficult time it has been to pay for health care for their family. The mothers had more than one job while taking care of their children. Fathers had 2 jobs. And they talked about how difficult of a time they've had as they've had added several children to their family in the last few years, how difficult it's been to pay for health care, to pay for these prenatal services that we're talking about. And they said, how...
1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. President. How can we justify that? We pay taxes. We're citizens of Nebraska. We're trying to work hard to take care of our family. Well, how is this possible that these tax dollars could be used in this manner? It really resonated with me. And so with those 2 grave concerns riding with me, ever present in my mind, again I stand in opposition to this motion. Thank you, Mr. President.